Gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chair Powell. As you know, one of the dominant drivers of inflation is housing. The affordability crisis is one of supply and demand. The demand for affordable housing far exceeds the supply. Do you believe, as I do, that public investments in an expanding housing supply would bring us closer to addressing the housing affordability and housing inflation crisis?
So I would agree that housing is in short supply and there's an issue there, but the question of how to address that is is one for you.
Right. But if public investment had the effect of expanding the housing supply, that would have an impact in reducing inflation in the long run. Is that a fair assessment?
Again, I'm reluctant to be drawn into supporting.
Nope, I'm asking just an objective description of the impact. I'm not asking for you to express support.
I think more supply generally, means that demand
Lower prices, right?
Constant, then prices would be lower.
Okay. Even if you raise interest rates, prices might nonetheless remain high because of supply chain disruptions. Catastrophic climate change will, over time, open a Pandora's box of supply chain disruptions. Is it fair to say that catastrophic climate change, if left unchecked, will likely lead to more inflation and not less, and will likely render the Fed less effective at reducing inflation?
Would climate change do that?
Yes.
Over a very long period of time, I think it'd be very hard to say, and it'll depend on what's the governmental response. It'll depend on what's the private sector response. It certainly has the potential. I think some people think that dealing with climate change will put upward pressure on inflation, though.
But in the long run, if climate change disrupts the supply chain, right, that will obviously lead to higher inflation, and that's the kind of inflation that the Fed would have most trouble reducing. Is that fair to say?
Yes, but again, I'm reluctant to get into an issue that we're not climate policymakers.
Yeah.
We don't have to weigh these decisions that you do. It's really a question for elected officials.
Regarding the present, how much higher could the interest rate go? What does the worst case scenario look like?
How much higher could the interest rate go?
Yeah.
So, no higher than it needs to go, but we think.
But what's the worst case scenario?
I wouldn't say worst case, but I'll tell you what I think. The point is to get. We think that first of all, financial conditions have tightened very broadly. But the federal funds rate, our own policy rate, is still quite low. So we want to get it up to neutral pretty quickly, and then after that, we think it needs to be in a place where it is moderately restrictive, meaning above the neutral rate, and that's only appropriate because we have inflation at a 4-decade high. So my colleagues and I wrote down sort of a range of 3 to 3.5% by the end of this year, and then maybe 3.5 to 4%. Now that's all highly conditional, based on many assumptions. I think we'll do what makes sense as we go, but those are rough estimates, I think, of what we think might turn out to be appropriate.
And then the Fed has a target of 2%. How long will it take you to reach the target?
So we, in forecasts, I would say generally, my colleagues and I expect that inflation will move down over the course of the next 2 years, much closer to the target.
My understanding is that one of your projections is that headline and core inflation will subside in 2023 to 2.6 and 2.7%, respectively. Is there any historical precedent for reducing inflation as rapidly as the Fed is projecting?
Well, yes. I mean, unfortunately, Paul Volcker had to do something very much like this, much larger, on a much larger scale. And but yes, we core inflation, core PCE inflation, has actually tracked down a little bit from the very hot levels of late last year, and is closer to 4%. So I think it's plausible that through using our tools and ideally the supply side healing, that we could get inflation down to those levels next year.
As I understand it, there are two models of CBDCs, intermediated and disintermediated. The Fed can either operate through the commercial banking system, or it can enable consumers to have direct accounts with the Fed. Which approach are you inclined to favor?
Intermediated.
Intermediated.
We actually don't have legal authority to provide accounts to anyone but depositories.
And you've said the Fed has said it does not intend to proceed with the issuance of a CBDC without clear support from the executive branch and Congress. Do you see congressional authorization as a policy preference or as a precondition for creating a CBDC?
I think we'll need to have an authorizing law, and I think we haven't decided whether we think this is in the public's interest. If we do, we'll come to you. Again, it's
But as a matter of law, or is it a policy preference? Like, what is your
a
view?
matter of law.
As a matter of law, okay.
Yeah.
I see my time has expired, so.